Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to our session today, which is focusing on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I'm Andy Purvis. I'm with the Global CCS Institute. I'm General Manager for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. We're going to cover a number of issues today around CCUS, and we have a panel that's, I think, truly global in its scope and its expertise. We have a relatively short amount of time, so I'm going to kick things off straight away, really, by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is Catherine Knight. Now, Catherine is head of CCS at Atkins, and we've got Atkins to thank for really helping bring this session together today. Catherine's worked as a CCS specialist for, I think, almost 10 years within the oil and gas sector. She spent a lot of time on CCS. In particular, she was lead process engineer on the CCS elements of the Gorgon project, which certainly, if you haven't heard about Gorgon, you'll be hearing a lot about it as we move into next year. I'm going to give the floor to Catherine and perhaps open things with a question around the economics of CCS and the economic models that are used on a commercial scale. There's a few of these used around the world, Catherine. I guess I'd be interested in your take on that. Start there.
There's a few problems going on with the slides. I'll just get the right one up. There we go. Come on.
Oops.
So getting CCS started, especially in the UK, has proved to be quite difficult, a bit like getting the slides up. Right, so this table here shows the four main regions globally where we've got large-scale, commercial-scale CCS projects, either currently in operation or in the construction phase or EPC phase. So starting off with Canada, which is perhaps the global leader along with the United States in terms of large-scale CCS projects, there are three currently in operation in Canada. One of the most exciting ones is Boundary Dam. This has been operating for a year now, just over a year. The reason this one's exciting is because it's the first one in the world to be applied to a power plant. So it's post-combustion on a power plant. Now the financial mechanism, so basically the high-level financial mechanisms for each one of these areas is also listed here. So enhanced oil recovery using CO2, so this is basically using carbon dioxide as a revenue stream in order to get more oil out of the ground. So this is being used to help make a lot of these projects commercially viable. So all of the projects in North America, so in Canada, in the United States, all of them, apart from Quest, and apart from Illinois Industrial CCS project, use CO2 as a revenue stream for enhanced oil recovery. A second financial mechanism is government co-funding. So the Canadian government have committed $3 billion Canadian dollars to help fund up to 6 large-scale CCS projects. And in addition to this, there's also the Alberta's carbon tax. So an example of this, how this is being used, is on the Quest project, which was started up last year and is in the Alberta province. So this is a way of avoiding having to pay 20 Canadian dollars per tonne of CO2 as a carbon tax. And this is set to increase to $30 per tonne in 2017. In the United States, there are 7 projects currently operating. The first one is even older than me. It's 1972 it was started. I'm 1973, so just got there. And again, CO2 enhanced oil recovery, but there's also co-funding in place. by the US government. They've committed $2.8 billion for 6 projects that are currently in the development phase. And in addition to the co-funding, there's also tax credits available in the US. Now, if the CO2 is stored in the saline aquifer, the tax credit can amount to $20 per ton of CO2 stored. This may increase to $50 per ton of CO2. This is a bill that's currently going through Congress, and I'm sure Tim can probably provide some more detail on that. If the CO2 is used for enhanced oil recovery, then it's only $10 per ton. In Europe, there's only 2 projects currently operating, and they're both in Norway. Sleipner project and Snøhvit. These are both use offshore storage. They're both on natural gas processing facilities. And so the carbon tax was introduced in Norway back in 1991. At the time, it was $35 per ton of CO2. It has since been increased, just over a year ago, I think, to $70 per ton. And that's quite a considerable sum. So hopefully we'll be seeing more projects in Norway. And because especially if you use something like a natural gas processing facility where CO2 capture is already part of the process, already paid for, then it makes it a lot easier to make it commercially viable. Then in the Middle East, so the first project started in Saudi Arabia just over a year ago. And the second project is set to start operating later this year, and that's in Masdar. So that's the world's first CCS project to be applied to a steel plant. And here again, we see the CO2 being used for enhanced oil recovery. So what do we need to make CCS happen, to make it commercially viable? Now, a lot of these early projects are what we call the low-hanging fruit, which basically means they're relatively cheap, so it's relatively easy to make them commercially viable. So a good example of this is the project that we actually went to see yesterday at Masdar. So this is a steel process. Normally with steel, you use coke as a reducing agent. You need carbon monoxide as the reducing agent. But this project actually uses natural gas, so it reforms natural gas. And it has MEA, it has the CO2 capture as part of the actual process. So you don't have to pay extra for that. And in addition, they've got the CO2 being used, that will be used for enhanced oil recovery. So there's a revenue stream. And a lot of the projects in the United States are natural gas processing facilities where the CO2 is taken out in order to meet pipeline specifications. Normally that CO2 is vented. But if it's compressed, it can be used for enhanced oil recovery or stored permanently in a saline aquifer. Now, a lot of the future projects are likely to be applying CCS to a power plant. The difference here, the CO2 capture has to be paid for. It's an additional cost. And this cost can amount to up to 60% of the overall costs when applying CCS, so it's considerable. And while the carbon price, whilst the cost of emitting CO2 is still relatively low, there's a big gap between between the costs for adding CCS to a project and between the cost of emitting CO2. So we need a way of closing that gap. And what we're seeing on the latest, more advanced projects is a transitional financial incentive from government. And the most effective has been so far co-funding of capital and operating costs by government. But project developers, private investors, they need to have confidence that this money is for the long term, that this money by governments is available throughout the project life, which is considerable, and it's secure. So a really good example of this is in the UK, where there might be a general lack of confidence at the moment because of the funds that were withdrawn. And Belinda Perriman from Teesside Collective will be speaking more about that later. So this transitional financial incentive from government will enable costs to come down, because the more projects that we have operating at large scale enables the technology to improve, enables efficiency to increase, which brings down the operating costs of these projects. It also enables network of CO2 pipelines and storage sites to be built so other projects can tap into them. And in addition to that, contingency will come down. A lot of these projects are first-of-a-kind projects. They are risky. There's an element of uncertainty as to how much they're going to cost. As a consequence, there's quite a high contingency on these projects. But as more projects are built, these will come down. In parallel to this, carbon price, the cost of emitting CO2, is likely to increase as emission targets become more stringent. So an example of this is in the UK. So the current target in the UK for 2030 is to have a carbon price of £70 per tonne of CO2 emitted by 2030. That's based on 2009 prices. If you compare this to how much it costs at the moment, say for example on the Boundary Dam project, which is reported to cost $100 per tonne, which is basically equivalent to the £70 per tonne. So we're not a million miles away there now. What gives me confidence is this is on Boundary Dam is a first-of-a-kind project, so that cost is going to come down. So that's...
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you. I think we'll take a bit of a local flavour. I'd like to introduce Arafat Al-Yafai. Arafat's a reservoir engineer, spent his career to date in the oil and gas sector. And I think, Arafat, you started to get involved in EOR about a decade ago. Almost. When you were in Total, I think, at the time. Yeah. You're now CO2 and nitrogen development manager for ADNOC, and probably well known by most of the people here today. And you've had a key role in the planning of this project here in the Abu Dhabi. So I guess I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about the project and the work that ADNOC's doing here.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum. Before I start, I would like really to thank the organizers of inviting Riyadh and ADNOC and Masdar to be today here. My slides have been shared also yesterday, so most of you have seen some of those slides, but I'm going to repeat it because it's very important to show the efforts that are being done today locally in the Middle East mainly. Because we believe, and this is the direction of our country and especially Abu Dhabi, to support the efforts towards lower emissions. I'm coming from ADNOC, which is an oil and gas company. Its mandate to produce oil and gas mainly, but respecting all HSE regulations, and for us HSE is number one. And global warming, CO2 emissions are also part of this target to reduce emissions, is to respect HSE as well. So it's in line with us, and it's mainly in line with our mandate of oil and gas production, which is EOR. Before I start my slides, I would like to share with you a short video which can give you an overview of the whole project, Riyadh project, which is in Musaffah area next to Emirates Steel. Then I go to specific slides in my whole presentation that can develop the message to you. Can you put the video please on?
The world we live in is confronted with extreme challenges. Energy demand is expected to grow 25% by 2030. Carbon dioxide levels will continue to rise as the global economy grows. Meeting energy demands while reducing CO2 is a challenge taken on by the UAE as a responsible and diversified energy leader. two of its most respected authorities in their field of expertise have teamed up to lead the way. ADNOC, or Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, is an integrated oil and gas industrial group active in exploration and production, refining and processing, chemicals and petrochemicals, and transportation and distribution.
Fundamentally, this project is going to reduce our carbon emissions. We're going to liberate more hydrocarbon gases needed for the power sector, and we're going to enhance oil recovery that will extend the life of Abu Dhabi field.
Masdar, Abu Dhabi's renewable energy and clean technology company, specializes in some of the world's most sophisticated projects.
We believe this project will contribute greatly to Abu Dhabi clean energy goals and affirm our status as a leading developer of carbon capture technologies.
Together, these companies have forged an innovative partnership to turn harmful CO2 emissions into a valuable resource to reduce the UAE's environmental footprint.
The joint venture between ADNOC and Masdar is the first company mandated to do commercial scale projects in carbon capture, utilization and storage.
Steel production, one of the pillars of our modern industrialized world, is also a major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. What if we could capture this harmful gas and use it for our benefit? As demand for oil and gas grows and exploration becomes more challenging, extending the life of our reservoirs using enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, is a necessity. Typically, water, natural gas or chemicals are injected to liberate the remaining oil. But what if we could use CO2 instead?
Matching supply and demand is what this CCUS project is all about. CCS, or carbon capture and storage, is not new, but has never really taken off due to the lack of a good business case. On the other hand, using naturally occurring CO2 for EOR is well proven around the world and locally, as demonstrated in a recent pilot project. It's combining these two concepts, using captured CO2 for EOR in an economically viable manner while storing the CO2, that makes perfect sense.
First, the CO2 from the production lines at the Emirates steel plant is captured, instead of being released into the atmosphere. This stream contains some 90% CO2. The feed is transferred to the neighboring compression and dehydration facility under construction at the project site in Musafah. The output is a dense phase CO2 stream of over 98% purity. The technology and project support for these installations was provided by Masdar. The dense phase CO2 stream now flows through a 50-kilometer steel pipeline to the Rumaitha onshore field, operated by ADNOC's Abu Dhabi Company for Onshore Oil Operations, ADCO. Here, the carbon dioxide is injected deep into new oil wells to maintain the reservoir pressure and enhance oil recovery. The CO2 is then stored underground. Not only does this scheme reduce CO2 emissions, it also frees up natural gas for use in Abu Dhabi's power and industrial sectors.
This joint venture with ADNOC is a clear demonstration of our commitment to reducing CO2 emissions, which reinforces the UAE's position as a responsible and true energy leader. The success of this project will definitely be a catalyst for similar projects in the UAE and across the region.
This project will put ADNOC at the forefront of new technology application and would demonstrate Abu Dhabi's commitment to the environment while maintaining sustainable growth.
Thank you. So I cannot talk more about the importance of such projects worldwide, and especially in this region, a region where we produce a lot of oil and gas to support the global economy and growth and sustainability. UAE is so committed to support the efforts, and Riyadh is a good example of that. So I will not emphasize on the importance of CCS or CCUS in this area. But I can tell you from day one, when this project was proposed or thought of at the beginning, ADNOC thought of CO2 EOR as the only way to start with, because of the examples that we had all over the world of CCS. As Catherine mentioned, there's only few examples operating CCS worldwide, and that's mainly not because of technical reasons, it's mainly because of commerciality. There's no revenue stream of the whole project. A government can subsidize at the beginning, but continuing with that, it's very difficult. So CO2 EOR is a good opportunity to overcome the technical challenges first, to prove the concept in an area that is not done yet, and also to understand the commerciality and the parameters, and hopefully to improve both technologies and commercial models with time. COP21 was a big success for the whole world, and we are there. CCS has to play a major role in this, and it's very important. The carbon steel, the steel factory in Musaffah area is the only and the first steel factory in the world that will see a CO2 capturing, and ADNOC Riyadh will take that to use it for EOR. And why EOR? Because we've been producing oil for many, many years so far, for the last 50 years, and that I can say we were producing the easy oil, which doesn't need much effort with new gases or miscible gases. But for the next 50 years, if we are very ambitious to continue such production levels and meeting our mandate of reaching 70% recovery factor, we have to start from today thinking about EOR. Now, CO2 is the best technique or technology for EOR in terms of oil production, but also it's one of the important things to liberate hydrocarbon gases that we currently use in our reservoirs to enhance pressure and to enhance production. So there is a multiple advantages of having CO2 EOR being implemented earlier in time, and ADNOC is so committed to that. And it's not something new, because United States and West Texas, they've been using CO2 for many, many years, since the 1970s, and the technologies are there. Today, they are further developing those technologies. This morning, I learned that also CO2 EOR is being studied for unconventionals, which is very interesting. So I think the potential of utilization of CO2 for EOR is going to grow with time, because the fields are getting matured, and also the global warming is putting pressure on that. And technologies hopefully will develop, similar to the development of technology that helped drilling deep sea, offshore areas. I think something capturing technologies will develop, and that will enable more of CO2 EOR implementation. The potential, especially in this Middle East area, is huge. An example, a study in the States, in an area, it has a potential of around 2 billion barrels to be added if we only inject 1 billion ton of CO2. In this area, in the region, we have huge fields, really supergiant fields, huge reserves that need huge amount of CO2 for the future. So there's no doubt that we will see a lot of CO2 EOR, even if we see some surprise at the beginning, but I'm 100% sure we're going to see a lot of them in the future. And the example is Saudi Arabia started this year, UAE we're going to start this year, Saudi Arabia last year, this year UAE, and I know that other countries in the region are studying seriously about CO2 EOR. So there's no doubt that there is a huge potential. From ADNOC side, we have a mandate from each of the ADCO assets, as per the new agreement, to inject 1.5 million ton per year of CO2. That's the planned volumes. So you can see how much ambitious we are in terms of CO2 EOR, which eventually will help as well the environment by less emissions in Abu Dhabi region or the UAE overall. And the learning that we're going to learn here and document it, we are willing to share it with all over the world in such forums like this. I remember a few years ago, we had a forum in Masdar Institute with IEA, and when you mentioned CO2 EOR at that time, it was kind of a taboo at that time, a very bad thing. But we were the only guys talking about CO2 EOR, but today I think it's already published by IEA as CO2 EOR is one of the mitigation they're trying to push for. Currently the projects are mostly, in the Middle East, we have only Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi. You can see that historically there's not much of EOR projects, but as I said at the beginning, that we will see an expansion of numbers of those projects, and there will be mostly CO2 EOR. The key thing to have a successful is number one, leadership, vision, and commitment or support. Without that, really this kind of new business will not be possible. Number two is collaboration. Collaboration between different entities. I'm talking about oil companies, which are very important because they have the reservoirs, they manage the reservoirs, but also with technology companies, academia, you have the environment agencies, NGOs, all of them are important to collaborate together towards reaching the objective of additional oil production at a lower carbon emissions levels.
Can we move things along a bit?
Okay, sorry. So what's next? What's next is we have to do it. to know it. So we have a lot of uncertainties in terms of drilling, in terms of economics, CapEx and OpEx, knowledge, technologies. Without doing pilots and development, we will not be able to improve the application of CO2 EOR in the future. That's all. I think we saw about the Riyadh in the video. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arafat. I'd like to move, I guess, swiftly to our third speaker, Tim. Tim Boersma is Acting Director, Energy, Security and Climate Initiative at the Brookings Institute. So Tim's worked in the private sector and in research for several years, for a long time. He's widely published. And Tim, I guess from a United States perspective, it'd be interesting to hear from you why you think CCS is important and what the challenges would be in 5 minutes or so facing CCS in the US.
I'll do my best. Thanks very much for the question. Thanks very much for being here. I didn't bring nice slides nor a nice movie, so you're going to have to deal with me. I apologize up front. I should say a few words about this study, why we did it. Brookings, we did a year-long study on global coal markets. Chief reason being that in North America, there's this narrative, and I think it's largely incentivized by cheap natural gas, that coal's finished. And you know, everyone, I'm sure that all of you know that the reality is more nuanced. The reality is certainly more nuanced if you look at the rest of the world, where in parts of that world, coal consumption is still rising at fairly substantial rates. And so if coal is relevant and a significant part of that coal is burned for electricity generation, then carbon emitted with that electricity generation becomes important as well. And so then the question is, what can you do about it? So as part of this study, we looked at CCS and where it is today, looking in particular at the electricity sector in the US. And the bottom line is simple, is that today CCS is the only technology that can achieve significant emissions reduction from existing energy infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure that is. So indeed, many studies suggest that unless CCS becomes a key part of a low carbon technology portfolio, it is increasingly unlikely that we will reach the famous 2 degrees Celsius line. So low emissions technologies such as CCS can play a vital role in contributing global mitigation efforts. And research has shown that in the long run, greenhouse gas emission reduction would probably be more expensive without CCS. And so there's the irony there that the upfront costs now may be prohibitively high. In the longer run, it's likely to be a very efficient tool as part of a wider mitigation portfolio. And so I'll jump to some concluding remarks about the challenges that we encountered in the United States in particular. We identified 3 key risks, and we think that a solution to furthering CCS, acknowledging the great effort that, of course, some in the U.S. have already made in the past years, but a solution will lie in developing a portfolio that addresses the 3 key risks. And not just one of them. I think it's important to note that the interplay is important here. So technology risk, a financial risk, and then finally a climate policy uncertainty. So we think that addressing the technology risk can be done by establishing a dedicated CCS trust fund of some sort, which you could support by a wires or public goods surcharge that could support R&D, but also, and maybe more importantly, large-scale demonstration projects at scale, along with other policy incentives and mechanisms. So in process and a structure for that program oversight that's targeted specifically for CCS, and I think it's key that it's not prone to sort of political shifts and changes. So you need an infrastructure that stays in place, preferably for a number of years with a dedicated budget so that it doesn't shift all the time, which, as we've heard earlier, can be a significant burden to development of CCS. So the financial risk, you can address it through the revision of existing policy and implementing new policies. So high capital and operating costs present significant barriers for CCS projects, as we've heard before. So access to financing is then important, and you can always improve it. You can modify government loan programs, modify tax credits. We've named a number of other potential avenues that can be explored. Finally, addressing climate policy uncertainty through creating markets for CCS technology. So you need a federal carbon policy, for instance, that requires carbon reductions or performance standards or a sufficiently high price on carbon in order to create markets for CCS technology. EOR can well play a role in that, but we did emphasize that in our view that is more like a stepping stone to mature CCS technology rather than objective in itself. And I think it's important to keep the eye on the ball, which is to limit carbon emissions and not developing EOR per se. So I guess the interplay of those three risks and a portfolio approach that stays in place, is stable, and well-financed could help further this technology. And as I outlined, I think it's important, critically important, that we get that done. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Our next speaker is Belinda Perriman. Belinda's commercialization manager at an initiative called known as the Teesside Collective in the UK. This is an exciting and bottom-up initiative to build the world's first low-carbon industrial zone based on Teesside. Belinda's got substantive experience in the CCS industry. She was the lead on the Peterhead CCS project in the pre-FEED stage, and she's also, prior to that, had a number of senior positions within Shell and led a number of projects. Belinda, the UK has, I think, had a fair deal of attention from a CCS perspective in recent months. There's been a significant policy change announced before Christmas, so I guess I'd be curious as how that change, which effectively the government decided to withdraw funding which had been earmarked for CCS technology, how that has impacted the efforts to promote CCS in the UK and make it happen.
Right, well, thank you very much. That's called go for the jugular, I think, in English. It is quite a change, indeed. It's 900 million, actually, so less than £1 billion. It's been talked about for, without exaggeration, 10 years to do CCS in the UK. So we really thought we were nearly there with two projects sharing this contribution, a grant, that would help to build the beginning of a CO2 network for the UK. So the government understands CCS, it understands the benefits of CCS, but indeed, this is what happened. It's not a vote winner, it's not a vote swinger. CCS, as probably everybody in the room understands and knows. Last November, we've had quite a long and difficult cost-spending review in the UK. You know, the world is a difficult place. The UK government was struggling to balance the budgets. Sadly, CCS, indeed, that's the one you can quite quietly, if you are in a bind, you can pull the budget. So I think also politically, the UK government, you know, it's very important what the consumer pays for electricity. So these two CCS projects were both on power. So it's also been well known that as first-of-a-kind projects on power, one on gas, one on coal, these would be relatively expensive. So there was no surprise during the front-end design. The price didn't change, so there was no shock at all in terms of what the price would be. But it's still, if you focus on the electricity price, it's a relatively high number compared to a weather-dependent, well-established wind price, a reducing solar price. But we don't yet in the UK really factor in the fact that you can, in the end with CCS, you can have dispatchable electricity. We don't really look at the fact that the wind is in Scotland, you know, blowing a lot more strong, and actually most of the consumers are further south than that. So the actual value of CCS, I don't think was really factored in, together with this fact that it's a politically relatively easy decision to pull the funding from CCS. But the projects like my own, the Teesside, together we were trying to do industrial. So indeed, it's a very big complex, Teesside Collective. It's the heartlands really of the Industrial Revolution. So many, many industries built over many decades, people working here, generations of people working here. But what we're looking to do is to collect carbon from some of these big heavy industries, and to piggyback, we were looking to do is to piggyback onto one of those first two projects. By piggybacking, sharing infrastructure, that's one of the very big ways to bring down the price of CCS. So I always say, you know, it's nice to do R&D, but I think it's been mentioned this afternoon as well, we need to build these things, we need to get on with it. So if we combine projects, we're now also looking at, in the UK, it's recognized that we need more gas-fired power. So we are moving towards a very clear date, very clear shutting of coal-fired power stations, but we are recognizing gas. And of course, gas with CCS is 90% cleaner again. In Britain, that comes within the definition of clean electricity, clean energy. So by doing this sort of power and industry combo, if you like, we're looking at presenting to the government a value for money package, a package deal, where we can also capture the, sorry about the pun, capture the economies of scale. So the two projects were big. They were industrial scale. They were 270 megawatts, so the big projects. But actually, if you start again and you build a gigawatt, you can capture, even on the post-combustion, your amine towers, for example, you can get the economies of scale on that. So big, chunky reductions in the price of CCS. So that's what we've been looking at, and that's what we're continuing now to present to the government in a way that we hope. Well, even yesterday, we had the second reading of the energy bill in Parliament. Of course, we're now post-Paris COP21. The money was pulled the week before the Paris meetings. So we're in a different world now. So we're optimistic that by repackaging, and that's not just branding, that's actually economies of scale, power, plus huge volumes, tons of emissions of CO2, we can present the UK government with a compelling value for money case.
Thanks. I guess in a few minutes, what CCS and CCS options are you looking at in Teesside, and really what are the next steps?
So the options, like the Peterhead CCS project, we're looking at post-combustion, so amine technology, quite well known, indeed not demonstration kind of science. So that's what's the plan A. So we had £1 million of funding from the UK government. We've been completely able to put all the data on the website. So there's many reports, a lot of data if you're interested to look at capturing from an industrial complex with post-combustion CCS. But we're also looking, interestingly, on Teesside, we already produce hydrogen. It was a great debate with the students, the hydrogen car versus the electric car, the Tesla versus the BMW hydrogen. Hydrogen, it's quite new, but I think the hydrogen economy, that's a whole nother route which we're looking at on Teesside. We've got a couple of villages who've signed up to look at hydrogen for domestic heating. We've got the possibility of a hydrogen train in the area. And then we're looking then at our big customers. So these process industries, actually we're asking, which of you actually need carbon in your process? Do you really need to be burning natural gas? And then we would have to collect the carbon dioxide from the back end of your process plant. But actually, if you don't need carbon in your process, how about on the same calorific value, at the same price, on a price comparison, we give you hydrogen, a clean burning fuel, would that work? So then we're looking at a more, as you can see, I just brought the map to show you, how much there is. Actually, if you could separate out the CO2 up front and then provide people with hydrogen, we happen to have some well-defined hydrogen caverns underneath this area. So they're not on the map, but they're just off the map. So we have even the storage potential for swing factors, load factors, we can build that in. So we've got all the ingredients in Teesside for looking at the kickstarting the hydrogen economy. And also just to mention, you see we're right by the beach there. So all that was built and the money and the time and effort that went into the competition to go to the North Sea, so that is an amazing, geological asset that Britain has. Those geological stores are not going anywhere. So they're well defined. We've got wells, we've got seismic, we've even got a platform, we've got a big pipeline, the GoldenEye pipeline, going out to that geological store, which has 100 years of storage. And actually yesterday, there was a report published by Scottish CCS saying you could have tens of years of European CO2 coming across by ship. So this asset's not going anywhere. So we're also going to the government and encouraging them, to keep the pipelines we've got, keep the platform. We even have a big pipeline running up Scotland as well, which can be used for CO2. So yeah, that's where we're talking to the government. It's sad what's happened, but let's create something new and a very clear value out of what's happened.
Thanks, Belinda.
So I didn't answer your question on CCU, the usage, sorry. I would just mention polymers. So we're looking at new polymers, and we're looking at mineralization. So again, on Teesside, we have quite a lot of experience with catalysts, a lot of people, a lot of skills with catalyst technology. So we need that, and we're going to use that. So we're doing research partnerships with local universities, and because we have pure CO2 already on Teesside, in fact, we grow great vegetables, and we use it for the food and beverage industry. So we've actually got CO2 pure streams already. So we'll be looking at demonstration projects on those specific usage as well.
Okay, thanks, Belinda. So moving quickly on to our final speaker, Dr. Julio Friedman. Julio is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fossil Fuel Energy in the US Department of Energy. He covers R&D and programs in clean coal and carbon management, oil and gas, pretty broad portfolio. He's a very well-known expert in the US and I think globally on CCUS. And he's had a long career in the DOE, research, and in industry. So, Julio, I guess to close things out, what's your assessment of the technical readiness of CCS? And I wonder how that compares to the policy readiness.
Sure. Let me endeavor to be brief in every possible way. First, CCS is a technically ready technology, demonstrated now for 80 years. We have done carbon capture using amine solutions since the 30s. We've stored CO2 underground for enhanced oil recovery since the 1970s. And we've done actual just storage for the sake of storage for almost 20 years now in the North Sea. We've had a 20-year research program at the Department of Energy looking at a whole set of risks, and the more we've studied it, the better it's looked. Since we began this work, the cost for capture has dropped by 50%, and the sureness of carbon storage has simply gone up. So from a technical perspective, we're ready to go. Really, the question is the policy perspective. And for that, I'm going to actually just jump into this from what I think is really new policy framing that's important. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made this study 2 years ago. I can't stress how important it is. In order to hit a 450 parts per million target, the 2-degree target, half of the scenarios fail without CCS. Most scenarios don't get there if you don't have this option. So if you're serious about climate, you should be serious about this because this is where the carbon is. There's only 3 ways to reduce carbon. Carbon capture and storage is one. Conservation and efficiency is the second. Shutting down plants is the third. That's it. That is the full suite of options. And this is important in those markets which are hard to scratch. In that exact context, if you don't have CCS, the cost of hitting that target more than doubles. It goes up about 140%. And the main reason why is the industrial sector. It's very, very hard to squeeze the carbon out of that. So if you're serious about this at all, you really need to be proactive. It's essential. That policy framework is one which has now changed very recently. In the United States, we've got the Clean Power Plan that has basically said we really need to set targets and stick to them. It's a strong regulatory forcing function. In that context, CCUS is considered best system of emission reduction on new coal plants and a compliance option for existing plants. That's great. In the context of the Conference of the Parties in Paris, a number of countries have listed carbon capture and storage in their INDCs. United Arab Emirates is one, Saudi Arabia is another. And so that's important. It's also worth noting for many, many countries, the targets that they've set are very ambitious, and their business as usual trajectories won't get there. Explicitly so, you need to be additive. You need to do an additional thing to hit the target. CCS starts to look like an additional thing. The real issue here, and I'm going to jump quite ahead, is really about policy. And really, policy is really about financing. We know how to build these projects. We've built a bunch. You need the money to really deploy these things. The world as a whole has seen terrific cost reductions in other clean energy technologies, and those have been accomplished through policy support that helps the financing. In Germany, it's been feed-in tariffs. In the United States, we've had production tax credits and investment tax credits and various sorts of things. On a dollar per ton basis, those could come in somewhere between $150 and $300 a ton. The cost per ton is actually very high, but there's many policy benefits which we've gotten from those, including the cost reduction for those technologies. We have been looking at this for a long time. About a year and a half ago, the UN came out and said we need policy support for CCS for the reasons that I began with. Since then, the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum, we had 24 ministers sign a communiqué that said we need policy support for CCS because it's important to our global climate goals. In the United States now, we're looking at a set of policy measures within the administration, including proposed tax credits for CCS. The President put it in his last budget, $50 a ton for saline formation storage, $10 a ton for EOR, and a 30% investment tax credit. That would certainly close the gap for financing and we get the deployment. Other countries are looking at other mechanisms, but we think that's important. It's worth knowing as well that in Congress, there's sets of draft legislation that are also looking at this. So there's an opportunity to say, we think this is important. We know we have to clean our rooms at some point. How do we close the gap and make this part of the ecosystem of clean energy technologies? Because ultimately, if we're going to hit our goals, we simply need to do more, and that requires policy support.
Thanks, Julio. I think I'm almost, if not entirely out of time, but I just wanted to see if there's any questions quickly from the audience before we close things out.
Could I ask a question?
Please, if you could identify yourself.
My name is Jerry Shannon. I'm in PB down in South Africa. The banking community don't tolerate any kind of CO2 forecasting in our financial models. I'm curious as to how you seem to have overcome that skepticism on behalf of the banking community, and is there any response to that from the panel? Thank you.
Let me speak to that briefly, if I may. We have a number of banks involved in our projects. What they really needed was surety. We gave them grants, which overcame a lot of the capital stuff and gave a good IRR to the projects. That helped, and it brought down the technology risk, which is something Tim had talked about. Policy support is what banks use to finance solar and wind projects. If they know that they're getting a feed-in tariff, or if they know they're getting a production tax credits, that's bankable. So the idea is to create policy structures that are analogous to that for carbon capture and storage or low-carbon fossil energy, so that the banks have that same policy surety. Let me give you one example that's brief. In the United States, the 45Q tax credits today pay you $10 a ton if you're storing CO2 for an enhanced oil recovery project. The problem is those credits aren't bankable because they're capped at 75 million tons total. So if you have a large capital project, those credits might get snapped up. A bank can't be sure that they're going to get those. Part of the proposed reforms that are in these draft legislations are to uncap that so that any project would be able to capture the full benefit of that. That way a bank would have the certainty for cost recovery. That's the piece that's missing. An equity partner would have the certainty that their equity would be met and matched and that they'd be able to get a good IRR. That's what policy is needed to create the financial certainty.
There's also a really exciting policy which we're hoping still applies to carbon capture and storage. It's basically very similar to a feed-in tariff. It's something called a contract for difference. So basically, electricity generators, they receive a market price for the electricity plus a contract for difference top-up up to the strike price. This, by having having that degree of certainty that this CFD provides, the strike price provides, so will then give private investors greater confidence because there'll be that long-term certainty in how much money they'll actually be getting back.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think I should probably close things down on that point. I think I have rather gone over my time. So look, I would like to close by, again, thanking Atkins for making this session possible, and to thank all of our speakers who've generously given their time to join us today. Thank you.